Today, we're going to be taking an in-depth look at Dr. Craig Keener, because he is regularly referred to in debates on the historicity of Jesus. So, I wanted to know exactly what Dr. Craig Keener thought about the mythicist argument against Jesus' existence.
Can we talk a little bit about the popular objections? Like you said, most scholars would agree, even in secular spaces, that Jesus existed. But there obviously are popular level sources that kind of make this claim. What are their arguments as far as them believing that Jesus never existed?
I don't actually know what their arguments are because I spend most of my time reading the scholarly work and working in ancient history.
Wait a second. You mean to tell me that a scholar who only reads scholarly works in ancient history doesn't know the most defensible scholarly objections to the historicity of Jesus? This does not bode well for this analysis of Dr. Craig Keener. If you want to fuck around and find out how bad of a historian Dr. Craig Keener is on this particular topic, then please stay tuned. What's up, heathens? How y'all doing? I'm the Godless Engineer, and I critically analyze apologist claims to give you the best arguments and information so that you can stand up and use your voice. There seem to be a couple of different types of apologists that exist out there. There are pop-level apologists like Dr. Frank Turek, and there are more scholarly apologists like Dr. Craig Keener. The former is easier to spot than the latter, but the latter often uses academia as a shield for their apologetics, but I assure you they are still apologists. Apologists will dogmatically hold to their position and not even give counter-arguments the time of day. As we'll see with Dr. Craig Keener, he exudes that same type of energy. Let's look at the first line of defense for any historical Jesus proponent.
I mean, if you look at the people who teach ancient history in universities around the world, people who teach Greek and Roman classics, people who teach New Testament, certainly. I mean, of those who have positions in universities and seminaries, the thousands of professors, I don't know of any who would deny that Jesus existed.
Well, I could pull out this Dr. Bart Ehrman clip.
That I hope that you all, as we say where I live, you all, I hope you all realize that expert opinion is opinion. Mike's opinions are his opinions, my opinions are my opinions, the people he quoted are their opinions. Opinions are not evidence. Expert opinions are not evidence.
Or this clip of Bart Ehrman and his debate with Mike Licona recently.
Because the vast majority of New Testament scholars are Christians. I mean, I'm an odd duck.
But I'm just going to echo what Bart Ehrman would say to this, and that's that expert opinion is just that, opinion. While this opinion should be important, in the area of New Testament studies, this opinion is quite broken. For instance, let's take a look at Dr. Craig Keener and his background. Dr. Keener got both his bachelor's and master's of divinity degree from private biblical universities. This was prior to him getting his PhD from Duke University. While Duke University doesn't have any kind of statement of faith, it is co-run by the head of the divinity school. Also, the graduate program's final part of its admission process includes an interview with the divinity school heads to see if that person will mesh well with the program. So it seems to me like the head of the divinity school almost nearly controls who gets into the graduate program at Duke University. Until an unbiased process is implemented to rectify this problem, Duke University's graduate program for religious studies seems to be an institution that's only meant to churn out apologists rather than scholars. In all seriousness, how can I trust a scholar that has been trained by religious apologists to be a religious apologist? I don't think I'll get any kind of critical information out of Dr. Keener, even if he has educated himself on the mythicist position. These types of scholars or apologists generally don't even read the relevant literature. And these are primarily the types of scholars that are defending the historical Jesus. Yes, even Dr. Bart Ehrman.
But on the popular level, and those maybe some people teach in other disciplines, but on the popular level, there's a lot of skepticism. People don't realize that by the methods that they use to say Jesus didn't exist, they may as well say the ancient world didn't exist. I mean, because they have to explain away so much evidence. Yeah, we don't have videos, but this is 2,000 years ago. I mean, the kind of evidence we have is better than we have for most historical figures in the ancient world.
I feel like Dr. Craig Keener thinks that mythicists want like pictures, audio recordings, or videotapes or something like that, and that's simply not what we're looking for. Like, we wouldn't expect there to be any contemporary drawings of Jesus, but we would expect that people that were writing about this type of individual would definitely have recorded Jesus as being one of those individuals. For example, Josephus records many failed messiahs in a very specific way, but he fails to mention Jesus even once in a similar fashion. Now, I get it. There are two references in Josephus that are extant to us today, but I consider both of those to be interpolations into Josephus's work. One of them, the Testimonium Flavianum, being a complete insertion that was maliciously put there by somebody in the 3rd century, 2nd or 3rd century. And then the other one, the James passage, I think that was an accidental interpolation during scribal transmission. Paul is the closest contemporary we have to Jesus, and he doesn't even unambiguously mention Jesus as a historical person. He actually does the exact opposite in his epistles. He separates himself completely from human history and seems to focus solely on the celestial Messiah. Craig claiming that we should just deny the entire ancient world altogether is childish. It's as if he's a 5-year-old child standing in the middle of his living room throwing a temper tantrum, going boneless on the floor, dragging himself around in a circle and screaming because somebody asked him for relevant historical information. You can have a sensible, evidential expectation for Jesus as a historical figure. We would expect people that were writing about this person to mention them in an unambiguous way that leaves no other option other than he was a historical figure. But we don't have that.
And actually, we know a whole lot about Jesus, not just that he existed, but I mean, there's a consensus among scholars from atheist to Christian. There's a consensus among scholars not only that Jesus existed, but certain things. He was Jewish. He was from Nazareth. The vast majority of scholars believe that Jesus was known for working miracles. Now, this includes scholars who don't believe in miracles, but they believe that Jesus was experienced by his contemporaries as a miracle worker, that his disciples believed that they saw him alive from the dead. There's a consensus around a lot of these things, including among scholars who themselves personally don't believe in miracles or that Jesus rose from the dead.
Yes, I would say that that's a good description of the kind of Jesus that we're looking for that would explain the origins of Christianity. The problem is that we don't have solid evidence for that person existing. That's not to say that there aren't scholars that have arguments that suggest that those are historical facts about Jesus, but their arguments are rather weak and they require you to ignore information that we have. For example, a lot of scholars will say that Jesus coming from Nazareth is a historical fact about the real historical Jesus because of the convoluted birth narratives that occur in both Matthew and Luke. But it is equally likely that this idea that Jesus came from Nazareth actually stems from an Old Testament prophecy, most likely Isaiah 11:1 or some lost prophecy or text that we don't have now. It's very plausible that there was some kind of misinterpretation about Isaiah 11:1 that leads a person to think that maybe Jesus was supposed to come from Nazareth. This explanation works really well for Matthew's claim that Jesus being born in Bethlehem and the idea that he was supposed to come from Nazareth actually stems from prophetic origins in the Old Testament. It also explains Mark's call to Nazareth amongst other calls to prophetic origins for Jesus. However, the historical explanation could also explain why Jesus is perceived to come from Nazareth and be born in Bethlehem. But a crucial element is that it doesn't make it automatically more plausible just because it's the historical argument. It means that we cannot know if this was a historical fact about Jesus because it's equally as likely that it was made up. This same process can be used for all of the supposed historical facts about Jesus that Keener listed. If there is an equally probable case that this information was just made up either out of whole cloth or by using existing Jewish literature, then that means you can't determine that it's a historical fact. Just because these scholars agree that these facts are historical facts about Jesus does not automatically make them historical facts. You can analyze their evidence to see if it holds water or not. And for me, these arguments are leaky sons of bitches.
Yeah. Can we talk a little bit about the popular objections? Like you said, most scholars would agree, even in secular spaces, that Jesus existed, but there obviously are popular level sources that kind of make this claim. What are their arguments as far as them believing that Jesus never existed?
I don't actually know what their arguments are because I spend most of my time reading the scholarly work and working in ancient history.
Then Dr. Keener has no excuse for his ignorance in this video. Currently, there are 2 peer-reviewed monographs defending either an agnostic or a full-on mythical Jesus. Dr. Richard Carrier's On the Historicity of Jesus is the most accessible monograph, while Dr. Raphael Lataster's Questioning the Historicity of Jesus is targeted more towards university libraries than it is an individual buyer. Considering all this, Dr. Keener seems to be willfully ignorant of the subject altogether. Is that because his job depends on his willful ignorance? I don't know. What do you think? And I just have to rant a bit. How in the fuck are you gonna be asked to discuss mythicism and not actually read any of the literature about mythicism? My advice to anybody that's looking to discuss this topic, whether you're a scholar or just a regular ass person, at least read the current literature about mythicism to see what mythicists are actually arguing. Being asked to discuss why mythicists are wrong and then do literally no research on what mythicists are saying is the mark of a poor scholar.
But I'm guessing they're just saying there isn't enough evidence, which is pretty easy to refute, or they say, well, the evidence isn't very good. But again, it's pretty easy to refute if you're talking about evidence from 2,000 years ago. I mean, the majority view among scholars today who work with the Gospels is that the Gospels are ancient biographies. And the nature of ancient biography developed over time.
When Dr. Keener is referencing scholars, he seems to be primarily referencing New Testament scholars. New Testament scholars are, of course, going to be agreeing with what Dr. Craig Keener is saying here, but that's because they're all theologically committed to the idea that Jesus existed.
The fact that the majority of New Testament scholars would agree with his 4 points is not proof that they are right. For one thing, the majority of New Testament scholars are believers in the New Testament. That is, they're theologically committed to the text. So of course they agree on these points.
Either that, or they're contractually committed to just ignoring everything that the mythicists say that proves them wrong. But, it's not even that mythicists are saying these things. It's just regular-ass New Testament scholars that are also disagreeing with them. But unfortunately, those types of New Testament scholars don't really get the time of day that people like Dr. Craig Keener get. I wonder why that is. What mythicists are saying is that the evidence for Jesus existing in history is very poor, and I invite Dr. Keener to give this easily accessible information that definitely proves us wrong. As someone who has independently investigated this issue, I find that there's very little evidence to support the idea that Jesus existed in history. However you want to conclude Jesus' existence, you have to at least agree how little evidence we actually have. Of course, Dr. Keener exposes his unreasonable position of considering the Gospels to be ancient biographies. But even if they were biographies, there are plenty of fictional biographies of characters like Adam, Eve, and Moses. Plenty of scholars have shown that the Gospels do not reflect accurate history, and we're unable to determine historical fact and fiction from one another within the Gospels. And if Keener thinks that Jesus exists just because the Gospels say so, then he kind of has a dumbass and uninformed position on the Gospel information. Sorry, not a dumbass, just a very Christian view of it.
In North Carolina, I was a member of a church in North Carolina years ago where there were people who actually remembered members of that church who had been born in slavery. So it was still within living memory in that sense. It's usually considered like 60 to 80 years. Well, all the first century Gospels are within that time frame. Mm-hmm. So in terms of having, for any teacher in the ancient world, the only one who might even come close would be Socrates, to have, multiple works written about them within living memory. So, the sources that we have for Jesus are enormous.
But that's not the entire story surrounding the Gospels. Dr. Keener either ignores or rejects the fact that the Gospels are based off of Paul's work as well as the Old Testament. Considering this and the fact that we don't really have any citations in the Gospels other than citing Old Testament scripture, it seems like there's no way for us to know where the Gospel writers got their information. Could this be information from eyewitnesses? Sure, but if you fill up one hand with possibilities and the other with shit, which one's going to fill up faster? It doesn't really matter that the Gospels are within 80 years of Jesus' supposed life, and that's congruent with other biographies of the time. Other biographies have citations and a discussion on sources. We have no idea what the source of the information was for the Gospels, and that fact alone dismantles them as evidence for Jesus.
So that's extremely, extremely helpful, because the weight that's put on proving anything in Christianity is incredibly high versus other historical facts that we accept is incredibly, incredibly low. There's a kind of bias in that. I'm sure you've seen that in scholarship quite a lot.
Definitely. Sometimes people say, oh, you have a Christian bias.
Mythicists just want to apply the same level of scrutiny that we do to other historical figures. I don't understand what possesses scholars like Dr. Keener to characterize mythicists as requiring more stringent evidence than we would require for other historical figures. We just want them to do proper history, and apparently that's asking way too much of a scholar. The fact is that the evidence for Jesus' existence is incredibly thin. The evidence also doesn't even begin to compare to evidence we have for other historical figures. These are just facts, and we aren't twisting anything. The New Testament scholars are the ones that are having to twist and misrepresent information in order to make their position look believable.
The best surviving source on Alexander the Great, who lived 356 to 323 BC, the best surviving source on that is from Arrian, a historian who lived in the 2nd century AD. So he lived like over 400 years after Alexander died. And yet the Gospel of Mark, the usual critical dating of the Gospel of Mark is only 40 years after Jesus rose from the dead. So, we're talking about a much shorter time frame, much closer to the time of the eyewitnesses.
I'm really glad that Dr. Keener brought this up because it's a good example of the big difference between gospel evidence and regular evidence. Arrian had multiple first-hand eyewitness accounts of Alexander the Great, including 2 of Alexander's generals. Arrian also thoroughly discussed his sources and told us why they were considered to be the best sources. While these sources aren't extant to us now, they were accessible to Arrian. Now, let's compare that to Jesus' gospel evidence. The Gospels don't cite where their information comes from. The Gospels don't cite their sources other than the scriptures. They don't discuss why their sources would be considered good sources or why they should be considered eyewitness sources. When you consider the quality of both groups of evidence, it's very obvious to see that Dr. Keener is just willfully ignoring how bad the evidence is for Jesus. Now, is that because of his theological or contractual obligation to be ignorant of that particular difference? I don't know, but I do feel like those are pressures that should be considered when you're thinking about how reliable Dr. Craig Keener is on the historicity of Jesus. Thank you, heathens, for joining me today. I really appreciate y'all taking a deep look into Dr. Craig Keener, what he knows about mythicism or the mythicist arguments, only to find out that he knows literally nothing about it. He's just pulling shit out of his ass. It was a pretty big letdown coming from a scholar of the New Testament. You would think that someone that prides himself on only reading the scholarly work that has been done in the field would have read the scholarly work that's been done in the field, but apparently that's too big of an ask for Dr. Craig Keener. If you will, please go down below and let me know what you think down in the comments. And hey, while you're down there, why don't you smash that like button and subscribe if you like this kind of material. Don't forget to stand up and use your voice. Bye, heathens.